He asked for his medicine with a low, trembling voice. She replied that she wasn't his nurse and locked the cupboard, so he'd learn. In his own home, the old man was treated like a burden, forced to endure daily contempt and cruelty, without defense or respect. How far can indifference go toward the one who gave us life? Tell me where you're watching from. Leave a like if this story touches your heart, and subscribe for more stories. The kitchen in the Polanco apartment smelled of bleach mixed with something sour, a forgotten soup left too long on the counter. Mexico City's late afternoon light filtered through the half-open window, bringing with it a cold draft that made the curtains flutter weakly. The faucet dripped in a steady rhythm, each drop marking time like a small mockery. Don Aurelio Martinez stood near the metal chair with uneven legs, his worn wool sweater hanging loose on his thinning frame. His hands trembled as he reached out, not for the chair, but toward the small locked box on the table where his medications sat imprisoned. The key dangled from Renata's designer belt, almost provocatively, catching the light each time she moved. She stood by the counter in her silk blouse and expensive heels, flipping through an interior design magazine without looking up. Her manicured nails made soft clicking sounds against the glossy pages. Around them, everything gleamed with perfection. Polished plates in the sink, steel pans on the stove, impeccable tiles on the wall. The apartment was a monument to order, except for the old man's shaking hands and the unsteady rhythm of his breathing. Don Aurelio cleared his throat softly. "Renata, please. My heart medication. The doctor said I must take it at 4. She turned a page slowly, deliberately. "If you really needed them, you'd get up and get them yourself. But they're locked. You have the key." "Exactly." She sipped from a glass of cold water, the condensation running down the sides like tears. Then she set it down on the table, just far enough that he would have to stretch to reach it, maybe fall trying. "You're not helpless, Aurelio. You're just lazy." From the living room came the faint murmur of a television, volume turned so low it seemed ashamed to exist. The sound mixed with the drip of the faucet, creating a rhythm of domestic emptiness. Don Aurelio looked down at his feet, at the spot where his cane usually rested. It wasn't there. His eyes searched the room, landing finally on the corner near the refrigerator where Renata had kicked it earlier. "My cane," he said quietly. "I need to sit down properly." Renata's shoe, a pointed-toe designer pump, nudged the cane further away as she walked past. "Walk without it. You're not made of sugar. My grandmother was 92 and she never used a cane." The comparison stung more than the action. Don Aurelio felt his chest tighten, but it wasn't the heart condition. It was something deeper, something that had Astis been building for months like sediment at the bottom of a river. He lowered himself into the wobbly chair, feeling each year of his 78 pressing down on his bones. The metal was cold through his thin pants. "I'm sorry for bothering you," he said, the words coming out automatically, like a prayer he'd learned too well. Renata finally looked at him, her expression not angry, but worse, indifferent. "You're always sorry, but you keep bothering me. When Sebastian married me, he promised me a life, not a nursery." Don Aurelio swallowed. His throat was dry, and that glass of water sat there on the table, so close and so impossibly far. He thought about his son, about Sebastian's face when he'd introduced Renata 5 years ago, the pride in his voice. "Papa, she's special. She understands the business. She has vision." Don Aurelio had smiled and welcomed her, had tried to see what his son saw. But Sebastian traveled so much now, his business taking him to Monterrey, to Guadalajara, to Houston. And when he was gone, the apartment changed. The air grew thinner. The afternoon light shifted, casting long shadows across the perfect kitchen. Renata's phone buzzed on the counter, and she picked it up, her fingers moving quickly across the screen. A small smile played at her lips, the kind she never showed Don Aurelio. She typed something, hit send, then set the phone down and looked at him again. "Sebastian won't be back until Thursday," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "Business in Puebla, very important meetings." She picked up her magazine again. "So it's just us, and I have friends coming over tonight, so I need you to stay in your room. I don't want them seeing you shuffle around in that sweater. It's embarrassing." The word landed like a slap. Embarrassing. Don Aurelio felt heat rise to his face, not anger, but shame. that particular burning shame that comes from being made to feel like an inconvenience in your own son's home. He nodded slowly, not trusting his voice. "Good," Renata said. "I'll bring you something to eat later. Maybe." She laughed, a light sound that didn't match the cruelty of her words. "If I remember?" The television in the living room continued its low murmur. A cooking show where someone was explaining how to make mole poblano. The irony wasn't lost on Don Aurelio. His wife Teresa used to make mole every Christmas, spending 2 days on the sauce, the smell filling their small house in Santa Maria la Ribera, their house where Sebastian grew up, where the walls held laughter and the table always had space for one more. Renata walked out of the kitchen, her heels clicking against the tile, the sound fading as she moved toward the bedroom. Don Aurelio sat in the wobbly chair, his medications locked away, his cane out of reach, the glass of water sweating on the table. Outside, the city hummed with life, cars honking, people calling to each other, vendors selling tamales and elote. But inside this perfect kitchen, with its gleaming surfaces and cold air, Don Aurelio felt the weight of silence pressing down like a hand on his chest. He reached into his sweater pocket and pulled out his rosary, the wooden beads worn smooth from his late wife's hands, and now his. He held it tight, feeling each bead, counting them without prayer, just counting, just holding on to something real. The faucet dripped, the light faded, and Don Aurelio sat very still, trying to remember when exactly he had become a burden, trying to pinpoint the moment when love had turned into tolerance and tolerance into contempt. Before this apartment in Polanco, with its perfect tiles and locked medicine boxes, there had been cobblestone streets and the smell of corn maza steaming in the early morning. Don Aurelio's fingers remembered those days better than they remembered yesterday. They remembered carrying heavy sacks at La Merced market when he was 16, his back bent but his spirit straight. They remembered the rough wood of his father's hardware store counter, the weight of hammers and the cool smoothness of new nails in their boxes. His father, Don Vicente, had run a small ferreteria in Santa Maria la Ribera, a neighborhood shop that smelled of sawdust, machine oil, and possibility. The wooden sign outside had said Martinez e Hijo, even before Aurelio was old enough to help. It had been a promise and a prophecy. Don Vicente believed in work, in honest measurements, in giving customers a little extra. "The peso you don't cheat someone out of," he used to say, "is the peso God remembers." Aurelio learned to work with his hands and pray with his heart. He learned that dignity came not from what you owned, but from how you earned it. When he was 23, he met Teresa at a Sunday Mass at the Basilica. She had been lighting a candle for her sick mother, and the flame had caught her hair ribbon. He'd helped her put it out, his clumsy hands surprisingly gentle, and she'd laughed instead of crying. That laugh became the soundtrack of his life for 42 years. They married in a small ceremony, saved money, coin by coin, and eventually took over the hardware store when Don Vicente's hands grew too stiff for work. Teresa sewed clothes at night for extra income, her fingers moving in the lamplight while Aurelio did the books. When Sebastian was born, they hung a new sign, Martinez y Familia. The store never made them rich, but it fed them, clothed them, and paid for Sebastian's education. In the small room where Don Aurelio now slept in the Polanco apartment, he kept his treasures on a shelf that Renata never dusted. A framed photograph showed Sebastian in his university graduation gown, his smile so wide it seemed to break the edges of the frame. Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, the diploma read, first in his family to graduate. Don Aurelio's chest swelled every time he looked at it, the same pride that had filled him the day when he'd sat in the wing auditorium in his only good suit, watching his son receive honors in business administration. Next to the photo sat Teresa's rosary, the wooden beads darker where her fingers had held them most often. She'd carried it every day until the cancer took her 3 years ago. The last thing she'd said, her voice barely a whisper in the hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and defeat, was, "Take care of our boy." Don Aurelio had promised, though by then Sebastian was 35 and taking care of himself quite well, more than well actually. Sebastian had built something remarkable. From a small office near the Zocalo, he'd grown a logistics company that now occupied 3 floors of a building on Paseo de la Reforma. Don Aurelio didn't fully understand what his son did, something about supply chains and international contracts, but he understood success when he saw it. Sebastian appeared in business magazines. He was interviewed on television. He drove a car that cost more than the hardware store had made in 5 years. The pride Don Aurelio felt was always quiet, almost private. When Doña Lupita from the apartment next door asked about his son, he'd show her the photo and say simply, "He's doing well, gracias a Dios." He never bragged. Teresa had taught him that real pride didn't need to announce itself. But sometimes, alone in his room, he'd touch the frame and whisper, "Look what our boy became." The building where the apartment sat wasn't like the old neighborhood. In Santa Maria la Ribera, everyone knew everyone. Doors stayed open, children played in the street, and the smell of different families cooking mixed in the hallways. Here in Polanco, everything was quiet, closed, separate. But Doña Lupita had moved here around the same time as Sebastian had brought Don Aurelio to live with them. She was a widow too, and she understood the particular loneliness of surviving your spouse. Once a week, usually Tuesday mornings, Doña Lupita would knock gently and bring pan dulce from the bakery 2 blocks down. They'd share coffee in Don Aurelio's small room, talking about the old days, about children and grandchildren, about the Mexico City they remembered. She never asked about Renata directly, but her eyes would sometimes drift to the closed door, to the silence in the rest of the apartment, and her expression would tighten. "You know," she'd said last Tuesday, brushing crumbs from her dress, "my daughter keeps saying I should move in with her in Coyoacán. But I like it here. I like having you nearby, Aurelio. We old ones, we need to stick together." Then there was Brenda, the young woman who came to clean the apartment every Wednesday. She was maybe 25, with kind eyes and a quick laugh that reminded Don Aurelio of Teresa when she was young. Brenda treated him with a respect that felt almost old-fashioned in its tenderness. She always asked how he was feeling, brought him water without being asked, and once, when Renata was out, had sat with him while he ate lunch because no one should eat alone. Brenda had seen things. Don Aurelio knew she had. He'd catch her looking at Renata with an expression that mixed fear and disapproval, her hands gripping the mop handle a little too tight. But she never said anything, and he never asked. What would be the point? She needed the job, and he needed to not cause trouble. The brightest light in Don Aurelio's days came through his phone, in the voice messages from Mateo, his grandson. The boy was 10 years old, full of energy and questions, living with his mother in Querétaro after the divorce. Sebastian's first marriage had ended badly, but it had given the world Mateo, and for that alone, Don Aurelio was grateful. The child would send audio messages about his soccer practice, his math tests, his hamster named Pancho Villa. Don Aurelio would listen to them over and over, saving each one like treasure. "Abuelo," the latest message had started, Mateo's voice high and excited. "I got a 9 on my science project. I made a volcano, and it exploded everywhere, and my teacher said it was the best one. I wish you could have seen it. When can you visit? Mama says maybe for my birthday. I miss you. Tell Papa I miss him too, but I know he's busy. Love you." Don Aurelio had played that message 4 times yesterday evening, sitting on his bed with the phone pressed close to his ear, letting the boy's joy wash over him like warm water. He'd wanted to respond, to record a message back, but Renata had been in the next room, and he'd learned that his happiness seemed to irritate her. So he'd waited, planning to record something tomorrow when she went to her yoga class. The past few weeks had been harder than usual. The sore on his heel wasn't healing right, and walking had become more difficult. Renata's voice had grown sharper, her demands more frequent, but Don Aurelio held on to hope like he held on to Teresa's rosary. At night, in the darkness of his small room, he'd press the beads between his fingers and whisper his son's name with a mixture of pride and restraint. "Sebastian will know," he'd tell himself, the words a prayer and a promise. "When the time is right, Sebastian will see." He never wanted to be a burden. Teresa had raised their son to be successful, to reach heights they'd never imagined. The last thing Don Aurelio wanted was to pull him down with the weight of an old man's complaints. So he stayed quiet, he endured, he prayed, he trusted that love would find its way back, that the boy who used to help him stock shelves and count nails would remember where he came from. The shelf in his room held everything that mattered, the photo, the rosary, and hope. Wounded hope, yes, but hope nonetheless. And in the night's silence, that hope was sometimes enough to carry him through to morning. The cruelty became routine in ways that were almost worse than dramatic violence. It was the steady drip of small humiliations that wore Don Aurelio down like water on stone. On Thursday evening, Renata served him lunch at 3 in the afternoon, reheated chicken from 2 days before that had gone sour in the refrigerator. The smell hit him before the taste, but he was hungry enough to try. She stood in the doorway watching him chew, his face struggling not to show disgust. "Waste not, want not," she said, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "My mother taught me never to throw away food." When he set down his fork after 3 bites, unable to continue, she snatched the plate away. "Ungrateful. Do you know how much food costs? But of course you don't. You never paid for anything in this house." The next week brought a new torture. Renata announced that they needed to save money on the laundry service. "These sheets," she said, dumping them on the floor of the bathroom. "You can wash them by hand. It's not hard. People did it for centuries before washing machines." Don Aurelio's hands were already weak, the arthritis making his fingers stiff in the mornings. But he filled the bathtub with cold water because Renata said hot water was too expensive, and he scrubbed the sheets as best he could. The soap was cheap and harsh, the kind that left his skin raw. After an hour, his fingers were red and starting to crack, the skin around his nails peeling away. He looked at his hands in the harsh bathroom light and barely recognized them. These were the hands that had built shelves, held his wife, blessed his son. Now they looked like they belonged to someone who was disappearing. The phone restrictions started in October. Renata declared that, outside of reasonable hours, Don Aurelio was not to answer calls. Reasonable hours, she explained, were between 10 in the morning and 6 in the evening, when she was usually out. His phone sat on the kitchen counter, just out of reach, and when it rang at night with Matteo's number flashing on the screen, Renata would walk past it without looking at him. "It's after hours," she'd say. "The boy can call tomorrow." But tomorrow Matteo would be at school, and the calls would go unanswered, and eventually they came less frequently. Don Aurelio felt each missed call like a small death. Another connection severed, another light going out. His cane disappeared regularly now. Sometimes Renata hid it in her closet. Sometimes she left it in the storage room down the hall where he couldn't reach without risking a fall. "You need to walk more," she'd say. "You're not made of sugar. You're just being lazy." So he walked slowly, carefully, one hand on the wall, trying not to think about falling, trying not to think about what falling would mean in this apartment where help might not come. His gait became a shuffle, his eyes fixed on the floor to avoid tripping over nothing. He spoke less, listened more to the clock ticking in the living room, each tick another second of endurance. The weight fell off him steadily, his jacket, the brown one. Sebastian had bought him for Father's Day 2 years ago, now hung on his shoulders like it belonged to someone else. The collar gaped around his neck. Brenda noticed on a Wednesday morning her hand freezing on the mop handle as she saw him emerge from his room. "Don Aurelio," she said softly, her eyes wide with concern. "Are you eating enough?" He nodded quickly, automatically. Yes, just getting old. Old men shrink, it's natural." But Brenda's eyes said she knew better. She opened her mouth to say more, then closed it, glancing toward the hallway where Renata's voice could be heard talking on the phone. The fear in Brenda's face made Don Aurelio's chest tighten. He wanted to tell her it was fine, that everything would be fine, but the words stuck in his throat. One night, suspended in that blurry space between sleep and waking, Don Aurelio heard voices from the hallway. His door was slightly ajar, and sound carried in the apartment's expensive silence. Renata's voice came first, sharp and low, the way people talk when they're trying to be quiet, but anger makes them forget. If he would just sign those papers, everything would be simpler. The lawyer said we could have the store property transferred in a week. A man's voice responded, tinny and distant. She was on the phone, the speaker volume turned low. Don Aurelio couldn't make out the words, but the tone was encouraging, urging. I know, Renata continued. "Sebastian is too sentimental. He doesn't understand that we're doing the old man a favor. What does he need property for? He'll never use it. But if it's in our names, we can develop it, make something of it." Don Aurelio's hand went to his chest, not from pain but from shock. Papers. The store property. The small lot in Santa Maria la Ribera, where his father's hardware store had stood, where he'd worked beside Teresa, where Sebastian had learned to count by organizing nails and screws. That property was supposed to go to Matteo eventually, a piece of family history, roots in concrete and memory. His breath came shallow. In the darkness, he reached for Teresa's rosary on the nightstand, his fingers finding the familiar beads. What papers had he signed? He tried to remember, but the days blurred together, and Renata had put so many things in front of him. Sign here for your medication delivery. Sign here for the building maintenance. Had one of them been about the property? The conversation in the hallway ended. He heard Renata's heels click toward the master bedroom. The apartment fell silent again, but inside Don Aurelio's chest, something had shifted. A question glowed in the dark like a candle that refused to go out. What else had he signed without understanding? The next morning, Brenda arrived early. Don Aurelio was sitting in the kitchen, Renata still in her room getting ready for her yoga class. Brenda set down her cleaning supplies and approached him quietly, her movements quick and nervous like a bird that knows a cat is near. Don Aurelio, she whispered, glancing at the hallway. I need to tell you something. But before she could continue, Renata's door opened. Brenda straightened immediately, grabbing her mop, her face going carefully blank. Renata swept into the kitchen in her designer athletic wear, her eyes moving from Brenda to Don Aurelio with suspicion. Brenda, the bathroom needs cleaning. There's mildew in the corner. Yes, Senora. Brenda's voice was steady, but her hands gripped the mop handle until her knuckles turned white. As she left the room, she let something drop, a tiny gesture that only Don Aurelio saw. A look, brief, filled with fear and complicity. She had seen something. She knew something. And she was afraid. That afternoon, alone in his room, Don Aurelio sat on his bed with the rosary in his hands. The beads moved through his fingers in familiar rhythm, but he wasn't praying the usual prayers. Instead, he was thinking, really thinking, for the first time in months. The locked medicines, the hidden cane, the refused phone calls, the sour food, the mysterious papers, the weight loss, the isolation. Each piece alone could be explained away. Together, they formed a picture he'd been refusing to see. Teresa's voice came to him in memory, strong and clear. Aurelio, when someone shows you who they are, believe them. He pressed the rosary to his chest, feeling the wooden cross dig into his palm. In the silence of his small room, with the afternoon light fading outside his window, something began to change. The dignity he'd thought was gone, buried under months of humiliation and acceptance, stirred like something waking from a long sleep. It was wounded, yes, battered certainly, but not dead, not yet dead. He looked at the framed photo of Sebastian in his graduation gown, at the smile that held so much promise and pride. His son, his boy, the child he and Teresa had raised to be good, to be strong, to do what was right. Sebastian will know, he whispered to the empty room, but this time it wasn't just hope, it was a decision. He needs to know. The question was how and when, but the certainty was there, solid as the rosary beads in his hand. This couldn't continue. This wouldn't continue. Somewhere in the fog of his diminishment, Don Aurelio found a spark of his old self. The man who'd carried heavy loads at 16, who'd run a business with honesty, who'd raised a son with love. That man, he realized, was still here, beaten down, but breathing. And breathing was enough to begin. The revelation came with the cheerful chime of a phone notification, innocent and bright like a bird chirping into a storm. Don Aurelio sat in his room on Tuesday afternoon, the door half open because Renata was supposedly out at her book club. The phone rested on his nightstand, and when it lit up with Matteo's face, his heart lifted the way it always did when he saw his grandson's smile. He reached for it, but his arthritic fingers fumbled. The phone slipped from the nightstand and clattered onto the floor, the speaker activating automatically. Matteo's voice filled the small room, young and excited. Abuelo, are you there? I have to show you something. My teacher said my history presentation was the best in the class. I talked about the Mexican Revolution, and I used that story you told me about Pancho Villa and the trains. Remember, you said your grandfather saw him once in... The bedroom door slammed open. Renata stood in the doorway, her face twisted with an irritation that had been building for months. She wasn't supposed to be home. The book club, Don Aurelio thought weakly. But then he saw her casual clothes, the yoga mat under her arm. She'd never left. "What is this noise?" she snapped, striding into the room. Her eyes found the phone on the floor, Matteo's voice still streaming from the speaker, now asking if anyone could hear him. Don Aurelio reached down, his movements slow, but Renata was faster. She snatched the phone from the floor, and for a moment, he thought she would hand it to him. Instead, her fingers tightened around it, and something in her face shifted from irritation to pure contempt. "Abuelo!" Matteo's voice came through, smaller now, uncertain. "Are you okay?" Renata's arm drew back, and she threw the phone across the room. It hit the wall with a crack, then fell to the floor near the closet. The speaker kept working, Matteo's voice now frightened, calling out for his grandfather. "Ya basta!" Renata's voice rose to a shout, her careful composure finally shattering. "Enough with your whining, old man. If you need your medication so badly, learn to live without so many pills. I didn't marry into this family to become a nursemaid to a useless burden." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Don Aurelio stared at her, his mouth open, unable to form words. On the floor, the phone had gone silent. Matteo had heard everything. And then, like a door opening in a dream, another voice cut through the room. "What did you just say?" Renata spun around. In the doorway stood Sebastian, his overnight bag still in his hand, his suit jacket wrinkled from travel. His face was pale, his eyes moving from his father to his wife to the phone lying broken on the floor. The business trip to Puebla was supposed to last until Thursday. But here he was, 48 hours early, and the timing was either divine intervention or the cruelest mercy. The silence stretched. Don Aurelio watched his son's face transform, watched comprehension dawn like a painful sunrise. Sebastian's eyes took in everything, his father's gaunt frame in the oversized jacket, the locked medicine box visible on the shelf, the cane peeking out from behind the closet door where it had been hidden. "Sebastian!" Renata started, her voice immediately shifting, smoothing, becoming the voice she used in public. "You're home early. I was just..." The old man was being difficult and... "Stop." Sebastian's voice was quiet, but it cut like a blade. He set down his bag carefully, deliberately, his movements controlled in a way that suggested he was holding back something volcanic. He walked past Renata without looking at her and knelt beside the phone. The screen was cracked but still lit. He picked it up gently. "Matteo," he said softly into the phone. "It's Papa. I'm here now. Everything is going to be okay." A small voice responded, tearful and scared. "Papa, is Abuelo okay?" That lady was yelling at him. She said bad things. "I know, Hijo. I heard. Can you do me a favor? Can you give the phone to your mama for just a moment? I need to talk to her, and then I'll call you back very soon. I promise." There was a shuffling sound, voices in the background, and then Sebastian's ex-wife came on the line. He spoke to her in low tones, stepping out into the hallway, leaving Don Aurelio and Renata alone in the room. The silence between them was explosive. Renata's face had lost its composure entirely. She looked cornered, her eyes darting to the door, to the window, to anywhere but the old man sitting on the bed. When Sebastian returned, he wasn't alone. Brenda had appeared, her cleaning supplies abandoned in the hallway, her face pale but determined. She must have been working in another part of the apartment, must have heard the shouting. "Senor Sebastian," Brenda said, her voice shaking but steady. "I need to tell you something. I've been wanting to tell you for weeks, but I was scared. I need this job, but I can't keep quiet anymore." Sebastian turned to her, his face still the careful mask of control. "Tell me." Brenda pulled out her phone with trembling hands. "I started recording things, not to spy, but because I was afraid. Afraid that something would happen to Don Aurelio and no one would believe it." She swiped through her phone, then held it out. "Listen." The recordings played in the quiet room. Renata's voice, captured on different days, in different moments, ordering Don Aurelio to wash clothes by hand until his fingers bled, refusing him water when he asked, laughing when he stumbled without his cane, telling him he was worthless, that Sebastian only kept him around out of obligation, that she was doing the family a favor by managing him. Then came the text messages, screenshots that Brenda had been forwarding to her own phone, messages between Renata and someone named Ricardo, discussing the property in Santa Maria la Ribera, talking about how to get Don Aurelio to sign transfer documents, how to convince Sebastian that selling it was the smart business move. With each piece of evidence, Sebastian's face grew harder, the control cracking at the edges. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. When the final recording ended, Renata's voice sang, "The sooner the old man is gone, the better for everyone." Sebastian closed his eyes briefly, as if in pain. "Sebastian?" Renata tried again, her voice now pleading. "Those recordings are out of context. You know how she is, always causing trouble, always—" "Don't." Sebastian's eyes opened, and they were cold in a way Don Aurelio had never seen in his gentle son. "Don't say another word." He turned to Brenda. "Thank you for being brave. You did the right thing." Then to his father, his voice softening just slightly, "Papa, I'm so sorry. I should have seen this. I should have been here." Don Aurelio's hand went to his chest, to the rosary in his pocket. His voice came out rough, barely used. "You're here now, hijo." Sebastian nodded, then straightened to his full height. He pulled out his own phone and made a call, his voice crisp and professional. "Jorge, it's Sebastian Martinez. I need you to come to my apartment immediately. Yes, now. I have a legal matter that requires immediate attention. Family law, elder abuse, property fraud. Bring whatever you need for documentation and witness statements." Renata's face went white. "You can't be serious. Over some misunderstandings? Sebastian, think about what you're doing. Think about us, our marriage, our position in society." "I am thinking," Sebastian said, his voice like ice. "I'm thinking about my father, who raised me alone after my mother died, who worked every day of his life so I could have an education, who never asked me for anything except to be a good man. And I'm thinking about the woman I married, who I thought shared my values, who I trusted with the person I love most in this world." He paused, his jaw tight. "I'm thinking very clearly, Renata, perhaps for the first time in years." From the hallway came another voice, elderly and strong. Doña Lupita stood in the doorway, her small frame somehow commanding. "I heard shouting. Aurelio, are you all right?" "Doña Lupita," Sebastian said, his voice gentler. "Would you be willing to stay? I'm going to need witnesses for what happens next. People who have seen how my father has been living." The old woman's eyes swept the room, taking in Don Aurelio's thin frame, the hidden cane, the locked medicine box, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I've been watching for months, wondering when someone would finally notice. Yes, I'll stay, and I'll tell you everything I've seen." Renata backed toward the door, but Sebastian moved to block her path. "You're not leaving, not yet. You're going to stay here until my lawyer arrives, and you're going to face what you've done." In his pocket, Don Aurelio's fingers worked the rosary beads. Teresa's rosary, worn smooth by prayers and hope. But now it felt different in his hands, not just a talisman of endurance, but a witness to survival. His son had come home. The truth was breaking through like light through clouds, and for the first time in months, Don Aurelio felt something he'd almost forgotten. The possibility that justice might actually exist in this world. The living room had never felt this full, even though only 6 people occupied it. The late afternoon sun streamed through the open window, catching the purple blossoms of the jacaranda tree outside and throwing delicate shadows across the white walls. Don Aurelio sat in the good chair, the one usually reserved for guests, his father positioned there deliberately by Sebastian. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. This was Don Aurelio's home, and he would sit in the place of honor. Brenda perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes darting between Sebastian and Renata, with a mix of fear and determination. Doña Lupita sat beside her back straight despite her years, her weathered hands resting on her knees like a judge preparing to render verdict. The lawyer, Jorge Mendoza, a thin man in his 50s with silver-rimmed glasses, had set up a small recording device on the coffee table, its red light blinking steadily like a heartbeat. Renata stood by the window, her arms crossed, her designer clothes and perfect makeup, a sharp contrast to the accusation hanging in the air. She'd tried to leave twice while they waited for the lawyer, but Sebastian had simply stood in front of the door, his presence a wall she couldn't climb. On the laptop screen balanced on the dining table, Mateo's face looked out from a video call, his mother sitting beside him. The boy's eyes were red from crying, but he'd insisted on being present. Abuelo needs me, he'd told his father, and Sebastian hadn't had the heart to refuse. Jorge clicked his pen, the small sound somehow official and final. We're recording this meeting for legal documentation. Everyone present has agreed to be recorded. Today is Tuesday, November 12th, 2024, approximately 5:30 p.m. Present are Sebastian Martinez, Aurelio Martinez, Renata Castellanos de Martinez, Guadalupe Flores, Brenda Soto, and myself, Jorge Mendoza, attorney at law. He looked up at Sebastian. Whenever you're ready. Sebastian stood in the center of the room, and for a moment, Don Aurelio saw his son not as the businessman in expensive suits, but as the boy who used to help stock shelves in the hardware store, who had inherited his grandfather's belief that honesty was worth more than gold. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was steel underneath. Renata, my father is not a burden. He's not an inconvenience. He's not a problem to be managed. Sebastian held up a folder, papers visible inside. He's the foundation of this family. He's the reason I exist. He's the reason I have everything I have. And you treated him like he was less than human. Renata uncrossed her arms, her face shifting into what Don Aurelio recognized as her social mask, the pleasant expression she wore at business dinners. Sebastian, you're upset, and I understand. But if we could discuss this privately... No. The word was absolute. Nothing about this is private anymore. You made choices that affected my father's health, his dignity, his basic human rights. Those choices deserve to be witnessed. He opened the folder and began reading from what appeared to be a medical report. Dr. Ramirez examined my father this afternoon. Malnutrition, dehydration, untreated pressure sores, medication irregularities that could have caused serious complications with his heart condition. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, but he steadied himself. The doctor asked how long my father had been homeless. He couldn't believe this happened in his own son's home. Renata's mask slipped. That's ridiculous. I gave him food. He just doesn't eat much. Old people are like that. You gave him spoiled food, Brenda said suddenly, her voice clear despite her trembling. Everyone turned to look at her. She swallowed hard, but continued. I saw it. Chicken that had gone bad. Soup with mold. And when he couldn't eat it, you took it away and said he was ungrateful. That's a lie, Renata said, but her voice lacked conviction. Sebastian pulled out Brenda's phone, the recordings already cued. Should I play them again? All of them. Or would you prefer I skip to the one where you discuss forging my father's signature on property documents? The room went silent. Even the sounds from the street seemed to fade, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Jorge leaned forward, his pen poised. Property documents? The hardware store lot in Santa Maria la Ribera, Sebastian said, his eyes never leaving Renata's face. The property my grandfather built, where my father worked for 40 years, where I learned what it means to earn an honest living. You tried to convince my father to transfer it to your name, telling him it was just updating paperwork for tax purposes. Renata's face flushed red, then white. That property is worth nothing. It's in a deteriorating neighborhood. I was trying to help the family by selling it to a developer, Sebastian finished. Your cousin Ricardo, specifically, who would have paid you a finder's fee of 200,000 pesos. I found the emails, Renata. I know everything. Doña Lupita made a small sound of disgust. I knew something was wrong, the way you looked at him, like he was dirt on your shoes. I told my daughter, I said, that woman has no heart. And the medications, Sebastian continued, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small key. Locked away like he was a prisoner. Do you know what could have happened if he'd had a cardiac event and couldn't reach his nitroglycerin? He was taking too many pills, Renata said, but her voice had gone thin. He needed to be monitored. By you? Sebastian's voice rose for the first time. You're not a doctor. You're not a nurse. You're just someone who saw a vulnerable old man and decided he was in your way. On the screen, Mateo wiped his eyes. Papa, is Abuelo going to be okay now? Sebastian's expression softened when he looked at his son. Yes, Mateo. I promise you, your Abuelo is going to be okay. He turned back to Renata, and his voice became formal, almost ceremonial. I want you to hear this clearly in front of these witnesses. You are leaving this house today, now. You will pack one suitcase with your personal items. Everything else stays here until the divorce proceedings determine what you're entitled to, which, given the circumstances, won't be much. Divorce? Renata's voice cracked. Sebastian, don't be dramatic. We can work through this. Marriage counseling, therapy, whatever you want. What I want, Sebastian said quietly, is for you to never speak to my father again. What I want is for you to face consequences for what you've done. Jorge cleared his throat. I've already begun drafting a formal complaint for elder abuse. Given the evidence, the recordings, the medical reports, the witness statements, the public prosecutor's office will very likely pursue criminal charges. There's also the matter of attempted fraud regarding the property transfer. Renata's carefully maintained composure finally shattered. You can't do this to me. Do you know who my family is? My father sits on 3 corporate boards. This will destroy my reputation. You should have thought about that, Doña Lupita said sharply, before you destroyed an old man's dignity. Sebastian walked to the kitchen and returned with the locked medicine box. He opened it with the key and placed it in front of his father. These are yours, Papa. You'll never have to ask permission for your own medications again. Then he retrieved the cane from where it had been hidden and placed it beside the chair. And this is yours too. Don Aurelio's hands shook as he touched the medicine box, then the cane. The rosary was still in his pocket, but he didn't need to hold it now. The prayers had been answered, not with miracles, but with something better, with truth and justice, and a son who remembered where he came from. Thank you, he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Sebastian knelt beside his father's chair, his hand on the old man's shoulder. I'm the one who should apologize. I should have been here. I should have seen what was happening. You're here now. Don Aurelio touched his son's face, his thin hand gentle. That's what matters. Jorge stood, clicking off the recording device. Mrs. Castellanos, you should pack your things. I'll need to document everything that leaves this apartment, and I strongly suggest you retain your own legal counsel immediately. Renata looked around the room, at the faces watching her with varying degrees of anger and disgust. For a moment, she seemed about to say something, to make one more attempt at explanation or justification. But perhaps she finally understood that no words would change what she'd done, what everyone now knew. She walked to the bedroom, with the bearing of someone going to execution, her heels clicking on the floor with a sound that had once intimidated Don. Aurelio, but now just seemed hollow. 15 minutes later, she emerged with a single Louis Vuitton suitcase, her face carefully blank. At the door, she paused. You'll regret this, Sebastian. All of you will. The only thing I regret, Sebastian said, opening the door, is not protecting my father sooner. The door closed behind her with a soft click, not a slam. Somehow, the quiet made it more final. The apartment seemed to exhale, the air itself growing lighter. The jacaranda blossoms outside the window moved in a breeze that hadn't been there before, and the evening light turned golden and warm. Don Aurelio looked around at the faces in his living room, his son, his grandson on the screen, Brenda, who had been brave when it mattered, Doña Lupita, who had witnessed and waited. This was family, not blood alone, but courage and kindness and the willingness to stand up when standing up was hard. On the coffee table, Jorge was organizing papers, preparing the legal documents that would ensure Renata faced real consequences. The justice system would move slowly, but it would move. And in the meantime, in this room filled with witnesses and light, a different kind of justice had already been served, the restoration of a man's dignity, witnessed by those who loved him. The legal consequences unfolded with the steady precision of justice that refuses to be rushed, but also refuses to be denied. Within 48 hours of Renata's departure, Jorge had filed a formal complaint with the public prosecutor's office for elder abuse under Article 343 of the Federal Penal Code. The complaint included Brenda's recordings, Dr. Ramirez's medical report documenting malnutrition and neglect, and sworn statements from 3 witnesses, Brenda, Doña Lupita, and Don Aurelio himself. The protective order came first, signed by a family court judge on Thursday morning. Renata was prohibited from coming within 200 meters of Don Aurelio, or attempting any contact, direct or indirect, under penalty of immediate arrest. The document arrived by courier, official and final, and Sebastian had it framed and hung in Don Aurelio's room, not out of spite, but as a reminder that the law recognized what had happened, that his father's suffering had been real and witnessed and would not be forgotten. The financial consequences followed with appropriate severity. The family court ordered Renata to pay compensation for medical expenses, emotional damages, and the cost of care Don Aurelio would need for recovery. The amount was substantial, enough to hurt, enough to serve as warning to others who might think vulnerability was an invitation to cruelty. Her access to the family business accounts was immediately revoked, and the prenuptial agreement Sebastian's lawyer had insisted on years ago became the shield that protected the Martinez family assets from her claims. But the most devastating blow to Renata's carefully constructed image came in the form of a community hearing requested by Jorge and granted by the Polanco Residents Association Board. The hearing took place on a Wednesday evening in the building's community room, the same room where Renata had once hosted charity galas and book clubs, where she'd smiled and networked and built her reputation as a sophisticated woman of society. Now she sat alone at a table facing 30 neighbors, the board president, and a court-appointed mediator. Don Aurelio was not required to attend. Jorge had argued successfully that forcing a victim to face his abuser would constitute additional trauma. But Sebastian was there, and so was Doña Lupita and several other residents who had witnessed small cruelties over the months but hadn't known how to speak up. The mediator read the findings aloud. Documented abuse, manipulation, fraud attempts, systematic degradation of a vulnerable person. Renata was required to acknowledge each finding, to speak the words, "I accept responsibility for these actions," into the record. Her voice was small, stripped of its usual confidence, and when she finished, the room sat in heavy silence. The board president, a retired judge named Don Alberto, spoke last. "Mrs. Castellanos, you are hereby prohibited from attending any social functions in this building. Your name will be removed from all committees. The residents here pride ourselves on treating each other with respect, particularly our elders. You violated that fundamental principle of community, and there is no place for you here." Renata left through the back exit, her designer clothes somehow looking cheaper in the harsh fluorescent light. The social circles she'd cultivated, the connections she'd built, the image she'd maintained, all of it crumbled because, in the end, character matters more than appearance, and cruelty leaves marks that can't be hidden by silk blouses and expensive shoes. 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning, when the city felt slow and peaceful, Sebastian drove his father to Santa Maria la Ribera. They took the long route, avoiding highways, letting the neighborhoods unfold at their own pace. Don Aurelio sat in the passenger seat of his son's car, properly medicated, well-fed, his cane resting beside him, not because it was hidden, but because it was there when he needed it. The old neighborhood had changed and hadn't. The streets were still cobblestone in some places, now mixed with newer pavement. The Kiosco Morisco stood proud in the center of the plaza, recently restored, its Moorish architecture gleaming white and gold in the morning sun. Vendors sold tamales and champorado, from carts that might have been the grandchildren of the carts Don Aurelio remembered from his youth. They parked near the plaza and walked slowly, Don Aurelio setting the pace, Sebastian matching his steps without impatience. The hardware store lot was still there, though the building itself had been torn down years ago. It was just empty space now, waiting for something, but the address was the same, and when Don Aurelio stood on that patch of ground, he could almost smell the sawdust and machine oil, could almost hear his father's voice teaching him how to measure twice and cut once. "Your abuelo Vicente," Don Aurelio said quietly. "He used to say that a man's worth isn't in what he owns, but in how he treats people when no one important is watching." Sebastian nodded, his throat tight. "I forgot that, Papa. I got so caught up in business, in success, in proving myself, that I forgot the most important thing you taught me." "Which was?" "To pay attention to the people I love." They stood in silence for a moment, 2 generations of Martinez men on ground that held their history. A woman walked by, selling pan dulce from a basket, and Sebastian bought conchas and orejas, the sweet bread still warm. They sat on a bench near the kiosco, sharing the bread without talking, letting the neighborhood move around them. A group of children played football in the plaza, their shouts and laughter echoing off the old buildings. An elderly couple walked past arm in arm, moving slowly but together. A teenager helped his grandmother up the steps to the church across the street, his hand gentle under her elbow. Ordinary moments of ordinary kindness, the kind that holds the world together when everything else falls apart. Hijo, Don Aurelio said finally, his voice carrying that particular rasp that comes from emotion held carefully in check. I didn't raise you to fight. Your mother and I, we raised you to do what's right. Sebastian looked at his father, really looked at him, the weathered face that showed every year of honest work, the hands that had built and fixed and blessed, the eyes that held both sadness and strength. And the right thing, Papa, is making sure you're never alone again, never unprotected, never treated as anything less than what you are, which is the foundation of everything I am, everything I have, everything that matters. Don Aurelio's hand went to his pocket, to Teresa's rosary that never left him now. His fingers found the familiar beads, smooth from years of prayers and hope and endurance. He thought about his wife, about the promises they had made to each other, about the child they had raised in love and sacrifice. She would have been proud of Sebastian today, not for his success or his money or his position, but for this, for remembering that honor means protecting those who can't protect themselves. Your mother used to say, Don Aurelio murmured, that dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away. It's something you carry inside, like a candle in a dark room. They can try to blow it out, but as long as you keep breathing, the light stays alive. She was right. Sebastian's hand covered his father's, warm and solid. But sometimes the light gets dim, and that's when family has to help it burn bright again. They finished their pan dulce as the morning stretched into afternoon. They watched the plaza fill with Sunday families, with couples walking dogs, with old men playing dominoes at small tables. This was the Mexico City Don Aurelio loved, the one that existed beneath the towers and traffic, the one where communities still knew each other's names and looked out for each other's grandparents. Before they left, Sebastian made a decision. Papa, I'm going to build something here, on this lot. Not a business, but a community center, a place where seniors can gather, where kids can learn trades, where families can get help when they need it. We'll call it Centro Comunitario Vicente y Teresa Martinez. Don Aurelio's eyes filled, but he blinked the tears back. They would have liked that? It's not charity, Sebastian continued. It's remembering. It's saying that this neighborhood, these people, this history, it all matters. You matter. The drive back to Polanco was quiet, but it was the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after important words have been spoken and don't need repeating. When they reached the apartment building, Doña Lupita was waiting with fresh coffee and the promise of stories from her own youth in the neighborhood they'd just visited. That evening, Don Aurelio sat in his room, no longer a prison, but truly his space, and looked at the shelf where his treasures lived. The photograph of Sebastian in his graduation gown, Teresa's rosary, and now, newly framed, a photograph Sebastian had taken that afternoon. Don Aurelio standing on the lot where the hardware store had been, his face turned toward the sun, his expression peaceful. The protective order sat in a drawer, necessary but no longer constantly needed. The medicines sat on his nightstand, unlocked, accessible. His cane leaned against the wall where he could reach it. His phone lay beside him, no restrictions, no rules about when he could answer. And Mateo's latest voice message played on repeat. Abuelo, Papa said I can visit next weekend. I can't wait to see you. Te quiero mucho. In the larger world, legal proceedings continued. Renata's case would wind through the courts for months, possibly years. There would be hearings and appeals and bureaucratic delays. But justice had already been served in the ways that mattered most, in the restoration of dignity, in the public acknowledgement of wrong, in the protection of the vulnerable, in the strength of a son who finally saw clearly. The city outside continued its endless rhythm. Cars honked, vendors called out their wares, families gathered for Sunday dinner, and in a quiet apartment in Polanco, an old man held his rosary and smiled a smile that was small and enormous at the same time, a smile that said, I am seen, I am valued, I am home. The final truth, simple as a sunrise and just as undeniable, settled into the room like a blessing. Dignity is not negotiable. It cannot be bought or sold, given or taken. It simply is, inherent in every person waiting to be recognized and honored. And when it is finally honored, when justice finally comes, the light it creates can fill even the darkest corners with hope. Dignity never negotiates. It simply endures until truth finds its voice.